So Safiye is from Seattle, Washington, was graduated with a BA in history from the New School in 2014. She received the Benjamin A. Gilman Scholarship and spent her junior year in Istanbul at Bogazici University. I don't think I pronounced that quite right. In 2020, she completed her dual master's program in library science and history of art and design at Pratt. Şentürk has interned at the Metropolitan Museum and the Gagosian Gallery and held a year-long academic fellowship at the Frick Collection. For summer 2018, between her 2 years in Venice, Şentürk was awarded the U.S. Department of State's Critical Language Scholarship and studied both modern Turkish and Azerbaijani Turkish in Baku, Azerbaijan. Safiye worked for Pratt in Venice for 3 years in Brooklyn and for 2 summers on site. Her research in the collections of the Mocenigo Palace Fabric Collection and specialized libraries in Venice provided the Venetian side of her MA thesis on silk textile exchange between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Republic. Safiye currently works at David Yurman, where she's assisting in book research for a comprehensive biography of the company founders. Safiye.
Firstly, I want to thank Deanna and the Pratt & Venice team that helped put this symposium together. I know it was a lot of work. Today, I will be presenting work from my master's thesis submitted this year, for which Deanna was my advisor. My thesis examines exchange of silk textile between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire from 1453 to 1571, and how in response to this active two-way traffic, the Ottomans established their own indigenous decorative vocabulary. My focus on the period between the fall of Constantinople and the Battle of Lepanto is determined by the fact that this is a period when successful Ottoman incursions into the Aegean required reassessment of power relations in the Mediterranean and new responses from the Venetian Republic, which formerly held sway in these coastal regions. This period also coincides with the flowering of Ottoman taste under Mehmed II through to the end of the reign of Suleiman. The lively trading relationship between the two Mediterranean empires enabled exchange of both manufacturing technology and aesthetics. My thesis looked at how the two competing markets may have affected each other's respective industries. Though the Ottomans were adept weavers of rugs and flat woven kilims, silk textile was not a part of their weaving tradition until the city of Bursa was established as a manufacturing capital. After the conquering of Constantinople in 1453 and the establishment of imperial workshops, we see a flowering of original design, including pattern and motif. International market demands helped create a vibrant industry. I looked at how both Venetians and Ottomans modified their production to satisfy external demand and foreign taste. Ottoman art is widely agreed to have reached its zenith during this period, when silk manufacturing was sponsored by the sultans. My thesis investigated the role played by sultan-sponsored workshops, considered what interests may have motivated them, and compared characteristics in contemporary examples from Venice and Constantinople over this period. In addition to purchasing Ottoman silk for garments and furnishings in Venice, Ottoman style began to heavily influence Venetian production by the late 15th century. The most common Venetian patterns are characterized by repetitions of clearly outlined ogival foliate or garland panels, encircling a palmette, pomegranate, pinecone, or artichoke motif, surrounded by radiating leaves or floral forms. Ottoman influence is evident in the use of elongated floral devices and serrated leaves. Eventual use by Venetians of popular Ottoman floral motifs, such as tulips, carnations, and hyacinths, also indicates Ottoman aesthetic influence. Use of Ottoman decorative repertoire was also motivated by strong demand for Venetian product from Ottoman buyers. Venetian manufacturers began producing silk specifically with the Ottoman market in mind. There are samples of Venetian silk woven with overtly Ottoman designs, clearly intended to satisfy foreign taste or for use as a diplomatic gift. This kaftan, with its ostentatious, oversized, undulating vine pattern, complete with heavy use of silver weft brocade atop thick silk velvet pile, is ostensibly Ottoman, yet was entirely manufactured in Venice and made of 15th century Venetian velvet, apart from its satin lining, woven in Bursa. Textiles such as these would have been produced with the Ottoman market in mind, or with consideration given to the Venetian state as a primary purchaser, as the Republic would require textiles, including finished kaftans, for use as gifts. Indeed, the high regard for Venetian silk is evidenced in the fact that many of the silk kaftans in the imperial collection at Topkapi Sarayı were not produced domestically, but came from Venice and other Italian city-states. In around 1472, the annual expenditure for the purchase of foreign-made luxury textiles, the bulk of which were Venetian, was 60,000 ducats. In addition to importing Venetian product, Ottoman silk produced in Bursa mimicked and adopted Italian motifs to satisfy both its own domestic market and Venetian taste. This section of Ottoman voided velvet, brocaded in silver and gold from the late 15th century, is a clear imitation of an Italian ogival lattice design, yet also displays Ottoman sensibilities, particularly in its dramatic looping intertwined stems. The most popular Ottoman formats for design were the curved lattice and staggered rows of stylized flowers, for example, tulips, carnations, hyacinths, or stars. These gradually evolved into the dramatic, large-scale patterns commonly associated with Ottoman taste. Ogival lattices would later be usurped in the 16th century by designs more uniquely Ottoman after limitations on Italian imports were placed in order to encourage domestic industry, resulting in a renewed demand for domestic product. The Conquest of Constantinople in 1453 by Mehmet II ushered in a course of transformational developments that affected the entire world order. The capture of the city and the complete collapse of the Byzantine Empire inspired eschatological projections promoting the revivification of an imagined ancient Roman Empire through the reunifying of Rome and the new Rome, Constantinople. Mehmet II viewed himself as being in the tradition of Alexander and Julius Caesar, a narrative promoted by Turkophile European humanists and subscribed to by Mehmet II encouraged the belief that the Ottoman Turks possessed Trojan ancestry. This lens through which to view the conquest of Constantinople transformed the conquest into an act of repossession and righteous vengeance against the Greeks for the fall of Troy. Mehmet II's obsession with Alexander and his belief in his Trojan ancestry created a direct link between Hellenism and the Ottoman Empire, thus integrating Ottoman Turks into a Western tradition which would inform his personal taste as well as his patronage of art and architecture. Though his interests were wide-ranging and his aesthetic eclectic, from a very early age, Sultan Mehmet II appears to have had a very strong interest in European art, which would be reflected in his later artistic patronage. A school book drawing preserved from his childhood includes figural caricatures he sketched using cross-hatching, displaying his early exposure to and understanding of Western pictorial methods. Figural portraits in the Islamic world, though not wholly absent, were rare and usually formulaic. The Western conventions used in Mehmet II's rudimentary pen and ink drawings portend his later enthusiastic private patronage of Italian art. Mehmet II was an avid collector of Byzantine marble statuary, Greek manuscripts, and Italian paintings, including those by Bellini. He salvaged and preserved a large collection of secular marble statuary, porphyry sarcophagi from the imperial necropolis, the imperial regalia, and sacred Christian relics of the Byzantine Empire. During his reign, the Sultan and his advisors forged a new cosmopolitan imperial identity through strategic creation of a new aesthetic of fusion that would combine elements from Ottoman, Timurid Turkmen, Roman, Byzantine, and Venetian traditions, creating a new cultural and geopolitical identity for the Ottoman state, functioned as a mediation, reconciling the conflict inherent in a multilingual, multi-ethnic, and multi-confessional polity centered at the crossroads of East and West. Forms of systematized patronage were developed following Constantinople's conquest. Mehmed II enriched his community of courtly artisans, establishing a core of imperial factories and workshops of court designers, including manufactories for silk textiles. The influence of the patterns supplied by court designers and the visual dissemination of their works during public ceremonies established their strong influence on Ottoman taste. The ranks of the imperial artisans would double in size to 636 by the end of the reign of his great-grandson Suleiman. Designers populating the ranks of these workshops were not exclusively discovered locally. Many, including some of the most influential masters, came from foreign courts. They arrived in Istanbul either voluntarily or as conscripts from Samarkand, Tabriz, Damascus, Shiraz, Herat, and Baghdad, as well as from the Balkans and Hungary. A substantial group of Tabrizi artisans and designers were brought into imperial design workshops by Sultan Selim I, following his decisive victory against the Safavid Empire at the Battle of Chaldiran and the subsequent annexation of Eastern Anatolia in 1514. Their taste was informed by the artistic traditions of the Turco-Mongol Timurid Empire, aesthetic models that were subsequently inherited by the Safavid Empire. The internationalized styles, motifs, and patterns originating in the decorative repertoire at Tamerlane's court heavily influenced the aesthetic direction of Ottoman art formulated in the imperial design workshops. The age-old socio-political interaction West and Central Asian polities had with China resulted in a strong presence of chinoiserie in the decorative repertoire of the foreign designers within the Ottoman court. The international Timurid style developed under Ottoman patronage and a post-Timurid aesthetic began forming under Mehmed II and his successors, reaching its height during the first half of the reign of Suleiman. The cosmopolitan aesthetic of Mehmed II would continue during the reign of Suleiman, whose influential Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha actively sought out European artisans to complement imperial workshops, then dominated by Safavids. Ibrahim Pasha himself was a Christian Devshirme conscript, born on the Venetian-controlled city of Parga, enslaved and converted to Islam, and raised to serve as an elite within the Ottoman court. Ibrahim's closest advisor was the Venetian statesman and jewelry merchant Alvizagriti, who influenced his positive foreign policy towards Venice and the patronage of Venetian artisans. Ibrahim Pasha's interstitial relationship with Venice and the Ottoman Empire may have played a major role in Suleiman's order in 1536 to have him strangled. The subsequent Grand Vizierate of Rustem Pasha heralded a period of intense creative development within textile production that reflected increasing religious orthodoxy. Rustem Pasha was fiscally conservative and vehemently opposed to importation of textiles and other luxury goods from Venice. Artisans schooled in the international Timurid style had dominated the first half of Suleiman's reign, but an aesthetic shift away from subtle intricacies of Persianate forms reflected increased conflict with the Shiite Safavid Empire and growing Sunni orthodoxy. Rather than conscript foreign masters, Suleiman increased the use of the devshirme system to populate his workshops, thus creating a domestic workforce entirely trained in the palace. From the 1540s onward, bold polychromy and enlarged motifs would characterize Ottoman textiles, as well as the popularity of the saz style. Saz designs contain flowers and foliation arranged at different angles with undulating serrated leaves. The saz leaves are pointed-tipped and sometimes dagger-shaped. Surrounded by these thick reed-like saz leaves are often pomegranates and flowers associated with paradise, such as carnations and tulips. The striking patterns and contrasting colors favored during the 16th century and onward allowed for maximum sensuous impact and visual immediacy, particularly when viewed from afar. A unified canon of visual idioms was formed, including the hilal, Chintamani, and nazar. The hilal, or crescent moon, was first used by Islamic people in the 7th century, likely originating from the imperial iconography of the Zoroastrian Sasanians. As a symbol, the moon and its crescent derivative possess not only beautiful visual impact and versatility as a design element, it is one of the primary auspicious astrological bodies governing human fate. The hilal sometimes appears in eye-catching nested patterns, forming both subtly and explicitly the image of the nazar, the popular ancient Mediterranean eye-shaped apotropaic talisman. The nazar pattern doubly establishes the apotropaic connotations of the crescent motif. In some instances, 3 nested nazar are used to create the Chintamani, a popular Ottoman motif inherited from the Timurids. Tamerlane used the 3-circle Chintamani as his heraldic emblem and on his coinage, possibly also on his official seal, personal armor, and buildings. In its most common form, the Chintamani is a triangular formation of 3 solid circles, often combined with 2 waving stripes. These mimic leopard spots and tiger stripes. Turkic culture's use of animal symbolism was widespread throughout Eurasia. The origins of this pattern are somewhat extraordinary, particularly because it has no direct Islamic association. The name Chintamani is a Sanskrit word referring to auspicious, wish-fulfilling jewels in Mahayana Buddhism held by the bodhisattvas Kashtigarbha and Avalokiteshvara. 3 jewels grouped together also represent the Buddhist Trinity or Triratna. The motif was absorbed by the Uyghur Empire in Inner Eurasia and incorporated into their representations of Manichaean deities. Thus, the adoption of this motif by the Ottomans may have been motivated by a desire to associate their empire with an older Turkic empire, once closely engaged with the world of Buddhism. In conclusion, absorption of Venetian modes into Ottoman textiles initially assisted in shaping a cosmopolitan imperial identity linking the Ottomans to contemporary and ancient Europe, as well as Turkic forebears and Safavid lands. As the empire established its territorial limits under Suleiman, a unique system of design conventions was developed. This system of indigenous design conventions is characterized by its sensuous immediacy, bold iconic expression, and vivid use of color. The distinct decorative vocabulary firmly distinguished Ottoman silk by the latter half of the 16th century and helped define the imperial identity of the empire, projecting power and majesty. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Safiya. That was wonderful. I like that you gave a good sort of socio-political initiative to it to put this all in context. That was great. Thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
You may, or you may, I guess it's up to you. Maybe let more people be visible if they have questions, maybe. So questions, observations for Safiya.
A question from Peter de Stabler. Could you say a little more about the weaving technique used and when and where they were invented? Oops, sorry, I skipped Victoria Boardman. I'll get back to you after this. It's the second time I did that.
Oh, I have to plug in.
Safiya, did you hear the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to read Victoria Boardman's.
Oh, yeah, I'll do that now.
And we'll go back. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Did you find any significance in the colors used in dyeing the silk?
Yes, actually, that is one of the primary ways that connoisseurs can actually distinguish between Bursa and Constantinople and Venetian silks, because we actually do see a difference in the use of the lac dyes that are being used. Essentially, they're beetles that are pulverized and you create pigments out of their shells. And there were some new beetles that actually were discovered in the New World that are later being used in Venetian silks, which we don't see in Ottoman silks, not half so much. And that is actually one of the ways that you can distinguish between some of these textiles that mimic each other so well that if it were not for that, you would not necessarily be able to identify as being Venetian or Ottoman.
Now to Peter's question.
Yes.
Sorry, could you say a little bit more about the weaving techniques used and when and where they were invented?
Yes, so actually the weaving techniques that are being used are not necessarily originating per se in any of these locations. They're coming about over the course of hundreds of years. They're being developed in different locations. Actually, for example, velvet, which I use a lot of examples of velvet weaving. This is something that we see in Egypt and in places like Alexandria before we see in the Italian city-states. We eventually see it in Sicily and in Lucca. And it's from Lucca that the weavers eventually are, they eventually are part of an exodus that ends up in Venice. And they are one of the primary groups of very skilled silk weavers that populate the guilds in Venice. So there's definitely a clear legacy that we can see from the Levant and North Africa into the Italian lower city-states and then up north towards Venice. Does that maybe cover a little bit of that topic? Or
sure. There's more. I'll go on to the more questions, and maybe if you need to, you can elaborate more in the chat. From Diana, thanks, Safiye. So you mentioned at one point a budget of 60,000 ducats for textiles. Was that a large percentage of the budget? Was there some political significance to textiles fabric that justified the expense?
Yes, in the Ottoman Empire, textiles essentially were a form of symbolic capital. And could be traded as such. And they would also be gifted as such. So if you were the Sultan during a public demonstration, this is something I cover in my thesis pretty extensively, they have these shows of gifting of these ceremonial robes. And they're extremely extravagant and extremely costly, but those who were in the court would have understood the value and would have been able to make value judgments based on the quality of those silk robes, what the esteem was that the Sultan was bestowing onto that person, what the reward was. And those people would subsequently be gifting, sometimes even re-gifting things that they had received. So it's in a kind of trade, but it's all done publicly. And you can actually make, you can insult somebody by giving them something that's less than what they would otherwise receive if they were in your good favor. So the Sultan is known as, you know, even Venetian delegates or saying, oh, this person is being shunned by this Sultan, being punished or being publicly humiliated because he only received this many ceremonial robes or of low quality. Regarding 60,000 ducats, yes, that's an extraordinarily large amount of money. How much of the imperial budget that encompasses, like what percentage, I don't know. I don't know that.
A lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
Question from Jesse. Would Venetian textiles made for Ottoman markets have been recognizably Venetian or generally Italian or European, or would they have been assumed to have been from local production?
Well, the bulk of the Venetian production that was made for the foreign market, the bulk of that is going to have stylistic differences that the manufacturers believed would appeal to that foreign buyer. But it was actually primarily the Venetian state that was the main purchaser. So they were purchasing these so they could use them as diplomatic gifts, because that was expected within the Ottoman court. So that was a major purchaser of these particular textiles. Sometimes they would be finished, entirely finished garments, and sometimes they would be just the cloth itself. Very often, the Ottoman courtly personages would actually list out exactly what they wanted. How many meters of such and such textile of a certain quality would they want, how many robes they wanted. Sometimes Ottoman members of court would explicitly say, I want 200 golden robes. I want, of Venetian double pile velvet. They were very explicit in what they wanted in many cases.
That's great. Are we okay with moving on? These are great questions and the answers are
Thank
so
you.
But Faye, were there other people waiting, or can we go ahead?
There are more questions, but it's up to you if we should move on. Maybe Safiye could answer them in the chat, I'm thinking.
Sure.
Or at the end, people that
Or
want
at the end, yeah, we can go back to them, of course.
to